Hey there, this is Ari. Welcome back to the Energy Blueprint podcast. Before we get into today's show, I have some huge news. We have my new book, Eat for Energy, that just came out on May 10th. It is kicking butt on Amazon. It's ranked incredibly highly right now. We're in the top 100 of all books on Amazon in the entirety of all books, not just in any specific category. And we're hoping to get down much lower or much higher, I guess you could say, and hopefully up into the top 20 or top 10 in all books on Amazon. I would love your help to do that. If you haven't bought the book already, go to Amazon, do that now, go grab this book, and don't do it, of course, just to help me hopefully get on some bestseller lists, but do it because the book is packed with incredible value that is going to massively change your life. Let me give you a quick overview of the content of the book. First of all, I will say this is not just another one of these diet books that's sort of claiming, hey, you know, everybody's got it wrong, and really it's not low fat, and it's not low carb, and it's not vegan, and it's not keto, and it's not paleo, and it's not Mediterranean. The one true best human diet is really this other thing, right? If you've been around for a while, you probably know that that stuff is nonsense. Those kinds of claims are almost always distorted and cherry picked. And, you know, you don't need another wacky, extreme, pseudoscientific, specific diet to try to adhere to that ultimately is going to fail. And you don't need to give in to that kind of gimmick anyway. You know, what I'm doing in this book is not prescribing some new specific one-size-fits-all diet that I'm claiming is, you know, everybody's got it wrong and really I'm the only person that's figured out the best way to eat. What I'm doing instead is compiling everything that I've learned in my over 25 years of studying nutrition science, and Alex Leaf, my co-author, his over 20 years of studying nutrition science. We're taking our combined 45 years of nutrition science expertise, and we've synthesized this huge body of evidence of how nutrition relates to energy optimization. So how can we use nutrition to tweak some of these key levers to optimize our energy levels? So levers like our circadian rhythm, our biological clocks. We've got a central one in the brain, we've got peripheral ones in the body, and they control many, many different neurotransmitters that impact on our mood, our focus, our motivation, our drive, our joy, our happiness, our sleep, our ability to be relaxed, and much, much more. And our energy levels, of course, and hormones. So things like thyroid hormone and testosterone and growth hormone and cortisol and melatonin, many, many key hormones that either directly or indirectly relate to energy levels and things like mood and libido and metabolic health and metabolic speed, how fast your metabolism is and how much energy is being produced by your mitochondria, how much your cells are healing every night while you sleep. And we're pulling nutritional levers to optimize that circadian rhythm and sync the central clock with the peripheral clocks. In chapter 2, we're talking about optimizing body composition using simple nutritional strategies that you can use to drop the excess fat and increase muscle mass and pull those two levers to increase your energy levels and help prevent dozens of diseases and extend your lifespan on top of it as an added bonus. We're talking about in chapter 3, it's on blood sugar dysregulation. Hypoglycemia and hyperglycemia, low and high blood sugar levels respectively, are major causes and contributors to fatigue and disease for many, many people, and poor brain function and poor neurochemistry in the brain as far as neurotransmitter balance. And we're giving you simple nutritional strategies to get your blood sugar levels under control, how to combat hyperglycemia, how to combat hypoglycemia, which is something that affects 1/3 of all adults in the United States. Hyperglycemia is something that affects over 80% of adults in the United States who are regularly experiencing at least spikes into the pre-diabetic or diabetic range, if not full-blown chronic hyperglycemia. And we're giving you very simple nutritional tweaks to optimize that and get your blood sugar regulation under control. The next chapter is all about optimizing gut health, which is a major factor in our energy levels and our risk of dozens of diseases. We know that there's a gut-brain axis. We know so what's going on in the gut massively impacts what's going on in the brain. And we know there's a gut mitochondria axis. And the balance of bacteria in your gut, how much, for example, short-chain fatty acids and butyrate and lactate they're producing, whether they're producing what's called urolithins, which are sort of metabolites of certain phytochemicals, which we know have a massive impact on mitochondrial health. And for example, urolithin A has been shown to be one of the biggest promoters of mitophagy, which is autophagy, if you've ever heard that, but at the mitochondrial level. It is the breakdown of dysfunctional, sort of broken, worn out mitochondria and the rebuilding of new healthy mitochondria. So how do we optimize our gut health, what's going on in our gut, using nutrition strategies to increase our butyrate, short chain fatty acids, urolithins, to optimize our mitochondrial function? And then the next chapter is all about optimizing brain health. You're going to learn so much there about, for example, there's a big focus on optimizing neurotransmitters in the brain, providing the right precursors, making sure you're not deficient in certain nutrients, and providing all the different cofactors to make sure your brain is synthesizing adequate amounts and the right balance of these different neurotransmitters that are affecting mood and motivation and cognitive performance and your ability to feel joy and your ability to relax and your ability to sleep well and your energy levels and your libido and much, much more. And in part 2 of the book, you're going to get a whole chapter on the top superfoods for increasing your energy levels. And the last chapter of the book is all about the top evidence-based supplements for enhancing energy production. This is amazing information that is stuff you're not going to find this compiled anywhere else online in this way. So this chapter alone is worth the entire price of the book by itself. You're going to learn about dozens and dozens of different compounds to optimize your energy levels, your mitochondrial health, neurotransmitters in your brain, to optimize your sleep, to optimize your gut health, and much, much more. Just to give you a small sampling, you're going to learn about supplements that have proven in people with stress-related exhaustion and fatigue to cut their levels of fatigue and brain fog and anxiety in half in 1 week, with further reductions out to 30 days. You're going to learn about another compound that's been shown to reduce depression and anxiety by 30 to 40% in just 2 months. You're going to learn about another compound that's been shown in older adults with chronic fatigue to cut their levels of mental fatigue by 43% and physical fatigue by 52% within just a few months. You're going to learn about another compound that's been shown with just 1 to 3 grams per day to restore mitochondrial function, the function of our cellular energy generators, in older adults with chronic fatigue to the level of healthy 29-year-olds, and which has also been shown in numerous other studies to repair mitochondrial membranes to help them function better. And that's translated into 30 to 45% increases in energy levels in just 4 to 8 weeks. And you're going to learn about two compounds that have been shown to be as effective as antidepressant drugs in combating depression, but without the side effects. And that's just a tiny sampling of all the things you're going to learn about in that chapter. Again, it's worth the price of admission just for that chapter alone. So go grab the book. If you haven't already, you can get it on Amazon. You can get it at Barnes & Noble, wherever your favorite online bookstore is. Go get it there. Right now, I promise you're going to be blown away by the information in this book. And if you already have the book, please go on Amazon and write a review for me. I would greatly appreciate it. It helps enormously to share those positive reviews with the world. And more people are going to be inclined to buy the book and be helped by it as a result of it. Please also share this book with everybody you know, your friends, your family, everybody that is not as healthy and energetic as they could be. Energy is at the core of having a good life. So one of the best gifts you can give to anybody that you love, anybody that you care about, is help them have more energy using simple and easy nutritional strategies. So go grab this book, share it with everybody that you love, write me a review. And most importantly, go get the book yourself if you haven't already. So with all of that said, enjoy the episode and make sure before you even get into this episode, if you haven't already, go grab the book. I really appreciate it. And I know you are going to be blown away by the information in this book and the studies. We have over 1,000 studies to back up everything that we're advising to do in this book. So you know that you can trust the scientific evidence, and you know, because we have studies to back it up, you know that you're going to get massive benefits by implementing this stuff in your life. So go grab the book. And with all of that said, enjoy the episode. Hey everyone, welcome back. I'm your host, Ari Whitten, and with me now is Dr. Stephanie Estima, who is an expert in female metabolism and body composition. She specializes in the application of the ketogenic diet, fasting, and exercise to female physiology. Using her framework, the Estima method, she's focused on distilling strategies in nutritional proxies, movement, posture, and mindset to actualize female potential. Dr. Stephanie has lectured at conferences and corporations over the past 17 years, is one of the top writers on Medium, and has been a featured expert in Thrive Global and on various morning TV shows. She hosts the podcast Better with Dr. Stephanie and lives in Toronto with her 3 children. So welcome. Such a pleasure to connect with you.
I'm so happy to be here. Thank you for having me.
Yeah. And obviously, very much in line with your bio, you're going to be talking about those things, about nutrition and training in the context of optimizing female potential. I like how you phrase that.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm really excited to dig into this. As I was telling you just before we started recording, the concept, the idea of training according to periodizing your training in line with a woman's menstrual cycle is something that there's starting to be research on, really impressive research, and yet very few people are talking about it. So I'm really excited to dig into this content with you.
Yeah, I'm excited to share it. And we were talking in the pre-chat, this has been born out of my own story and working with patients and really seeing that for the most part, when we can become attuned to and tuned into our own natural rhythms, our own natural cadence, and we can nuance the protocols, whether it's fasting, whether it's the food that you're eating and the variation of macronutrients and your training. This is when we can start to really move towards optimizing female, the female potential and what it's really supposed to be. So very excited to be here and to be nerding out with you.
Beautiful. So
yeah.
First of all, tell me about, I guess, the 3 types of energy or 3 ways our body produces energy.
Yeah. So often when we think about energy, we want to be thinking about where it comes from. So we think about, when I am talking about the ability to create energy, we're talking about from precursors. So precursors can come from within the body and they can come from outside the body. So this can be internal or endogenous sources of precursors and exogenous or external sources of precursors. And really what we're talking about here is food. So when we think about external sources of fuel, of course, we're talking about our dietary carbohydrates, our dietary proteins, and our dietary fats. Those are going to be broken down into precursors for energy. So I hope I'm not giving anybody nightmares from high school biology, but what we're talking about here is creating ATP, which is the energetic currency that every single cell trades in. So those external sources of food can be used to and are used to create energy. When we consume excess food, so when we consume more carbohydrates than are needed, more fat that is needed, our body doesn't throw those away, much to our chagrin, right? Our bodies will keep those for a rainy day. So we will store excess carbohydrates first in the form of glycogen, and the 2 areas that is where we most readily store glycogen is in the liver and in the muscles. And then excess carbs and excess fat after that are then stored in the adipose tissue or in our fat cells. And of course, we know that a triglyceride, which is the storage molecule of fat, we have a backbone of glycerin and then 3 fatty acids that are there. So when we are thinking about where food comes from, first we want to be thinking about the precursors, like the substrates. The other things that affect energy are hormonal responses. So whether or not you have an appropriate hormonal response, a really good example of that would be the glucose insulin dance, right? So when we think about a type 2 diabetic, this is an example of the glucose insulin dance, or every time you eat something, there's going to be a hormonal response to it. So a type 2 diabetic is going to have a deranged insulin response in response to glucose. So we want to be looking at hormones that are in balance. And there are hormones, particularly with women, that can become imbalanced and deranged, and that can cause chronic low-grade inflammation and stress. And that can influence our menstrual cycle, it can influence our moods, it can influence our sleep, our circadian biology. So I wanted to talk today about some of those and do a bit of a deeper dive with you in terms of some of the different parameters or some of the different hormones that can go awry that are both specific to women, but also, there are some hormones that we share with guys that can also be that we have a particular sensitivity to, or a particular pattern that is unique to females.
Beautiful.
Yeah. So whenever we think about women, of course, the thing that pops to mind is the dimorphism that comes up is, oh, well, women have a menstrual cycle. And of course, that's very true. And we're going to be talking about that today. Before we get in there, though, I wanted to talk about some of the other ways that females, and particularly our hormones, are distinct from our male counterparts. And the 2 hormones I want to focus in on are leptin, which is a hormone that is involved in keeping us feeling full. It's our satiety hormone. And the other branch or grouping of hormones are our stress hormones. So we want to be talking about cortisol, we want to be talking about adrenaline, and in general, the sympathetic nervous system. And the reason, and before I even get into that, the other 2 areas that I just wanted to plant seeds for the listeners listening to this is we also have sexually dimorphic organs as well. So we all think, well, a liver is a liver is a liver is a liver. And what we understand about women and men is that there is different expressions of genes in the female liver versus the male. There's different pulsatile patterns. Specifically, I'm talking about growth hormone in the liver. And we also have differences in other organs like our brains. So when you marinate a brain in testosterone, you're going to have different areas of the brain that are going to grow and that are going to proliferate. And the same is true when you marinate a brain in estrogen, which is typically it's the phenotypic expression of women or a female. When you have areas that are marinating in estrogen during development, you're going to have, and estrogen is a growth factor, you're going to have different areas of the brain that are larger. So just as a point of, if you want, some random knowledge at your next party, or, random party tricks, things like the amygdala, we know is a hyper responder to testosterone. So what we find is in the male brain, the area of the brain that's involved in emotional regulation, it tends to be larger. Areas in the female brain that tend to be larger are the anterior cingulate cortex, which is involved in emotional regulation and being able to perceive in another person their emotional state. And there's other areas. We can go on a different geeky magic carpet ride another time. But
just real quick, you said for the amygdala that it's emotional regulation. Was that?
Oh, it's anger. So when we think about the amygdala, when we think about anger and being fearful, that is the area of the brain that is involved in that.
So for men, it's more like fear and stress sort of danger perception rather than
Yeah,
emotional
or
regulation?
aggressive. Yeah, or the other way that can manifest is an aggressive behavior. So you'll often
Okay.
find when you look at before we see socialized little girls and boys, you'll often see that boys are much more physical than their female counterparts are.
Okay. I just wanted to clarify because you said emotional regulation for both of them, and I thought maybe you meant to say more anger, stress
I
for
meant
the.
anger.
Okay.
Thank you for clarifying that. Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
Cool. Just wanted to make sure because I don't want any of our listeners to come away thinking that men are better than women at emotional regulation.
I would argue that neither are. It really does depend on the integrity of your prefrontal cortex, which can be, and this is maybe a different conversation, but the prefrontal cortex is the area of the brain that is involved in dampening the response in the limbic system, of which
Mhm.
the amygdala is a part of.
Gotcha.
So things like we'll talk about this in terms of parasympathetics, tools like meditation, tools like exercise, where we are increasing blood flow to these higher centers of the brain are what's important, and we'll be talking about some of those strategies today too.
Awesome. So where do we go from here? What are some of the biggest, hormonal differentiators between men and women, and how does that relate to nutrition and exercise factors or other lifestyle factors that women in particular need to be aware of?
Sure. So we had talked about, or I'd sort of introduced a few hormones: leptin, cortisol, and the sympathetic system. And then I also wanted to talk about sex hormones today. So we can start with leptin, which is the satiety hormone. That is the hormone that makes us feel full. It is secreted from our fat tissue, our adipose tissue, and it's in response to caloric consumption. So when you have taken in enough calories, leptin is going to start being released from your fat cells, and that's going to go up to an area in your brain that regulates your appetite, and it's going to tell that area of the brain it's time to stop eating. Right? You've had enough, and to put the fork down. What's interesting about females in particular is that, and this is particularly true of women who've been on a diet their whole life. So they've practiced some sort of caloric restriction, or they are engaging in fasting. And I want to put a little asterisk next to fasting because we're going to come back to that in our conversation today, because we should not be fasting like men. So I'll just kind of plant that little seed. But for women who've been on a diet their whole lives, or even for women who have excess weight on them, what we know is that women will hit the point sooner of getting hungry. For like any woman who's been on a diet knows that she can't necessarily, or like she's calorically restricting, she can't be on that diet for a long time. And it will also take her longer to feel full. And I can include some of the research that has gone in around this for your listeners if you think it's useful.
Yeah,
But
absolutely.
what we're talking about here is what is known as leptin resistance. So females are much more susceptible to leptin resistance than their male counterparts. So what that means is, normally when you eat, leptin is released, the brain picks up on that signal, and it says, okay, I've had enough calories, I'm going to stop eating. For women, we need to secrete much more leptin for that signal to get through, because the brain, for whatever reason, has downregulated its sensitivity. The area in the brain is called the hypothalamus, but the hypothalamus has downregulated its sensitivity to leptin. So as a result, what happens is, of course, we continue to eat. So we continue to consume calories. And of course, with excess caloric consumption, we have weight gain with that. So there was a really great study, and this was around the time when I was actually discovering leptin. I was still a student at school, and I had put on about, I can't remember, it was like they always talk about the freshman 15, and I was like the overachiever. I put on the freshman 40. And I remember, with my student subscription to, PubMed at the time, finding this study, and what and I'll link it, I'll send you the link, Ari, but for every measure of obesity, so every given measure of BMI, when women and men were matched pound for pound, what they found was men exhibited lower levels of leptin for every measure of obesity. So that's important because that means that as women, we don't get that hunger signal as quickly as the guys do. So that's one way. And it's very similar when we think about leptin resistance. It's very similar to insulin resistance. So when we think about a type 2 diabetic, again, using that example, someone who has their insulin levels constantly elevated because they're taking in that excess carbohydrate, that excess exogenous substrate, the cells will downregulate their sensitivity to insulin so that it is harder to get the blood glucose into the cell in order to create ATP, or in order to create that energy. And of course, as you very well know, one of the common symptoms of a type 2 diabetic, in addition to likely being overweight and inflamed, is they suffer from brain fog, they suffer from fatigue, from circadian like sleep disturbances and wakefulness, and feeling like they have a consistent amount of energy throughout the day without needing to go on that sugar roller coaster that they often do. So I'd wanted to talk about leptin. The other hormone or cluster of hormones that I wanted to talk about are under the branch of what I would call the sympathetic nervous system. So when we talk about epinephrine, adrenaline, cortisol, and of course we know that if you are a woman and you have leptin issues, which most of us do to begin with, you are already by default in a state of chronic low-grade stress, because if you are consistently not putting down the fork because you're not getting that signal of satiety or fullness, you're going to have excess adipose tissue. You're going to have excess fat, that excess stored food. And being overweight is one of the ways that we generally can be more inflamed over the long run. So we have the leptin issue. For women, particularly if you are a woman somewhere around your 30s and beyond, she's had one or more pregnancies, she's had one or more labor and deliveries, recovery from said pregnancies, breastfeeding, and then, the wild ride of sleep deprivation that's, commonly referred to as parenting, leaves these women completely exhausted. Like, they're running on adrenaline all day long. And we don't have, for a lot of, at least for the women that I've worked with, what I find is that, and I'll also say this, even if you don't have children, so even if there's a woman listening, it's like, well, this doesn't apply to me, I don't have kids. You likely if you don't have children, you likely are working. And what we know about women in general is they also do the majority of non-paid work in the home. So if you have a career, with or without kids, or you have kids thrown into the mix, when you come home at night, you're probably doing the laundry, you're probably doing the cooking, you're probably doing the cleaning. If you have kids, you're doing the homework and the kids scheduling and all that kind of stuff. And this is data that's collected year over year from the United States, from Canada, and from Britain. And I look at these three countries because these are the populations of people that I work with. And generally, a woman does somewhere between 60 and 70% of the unpaid work at home. So in addition to the chemical stressors of pregnancy and recovery and breastfeeding and all of that, and the physical and chemical and emotional stressors of working in a career, she's also burning the candle at the other end of the stick at home. So and when I give this, and usually when I'm talking to, I'm either, I'm speaking to a live group of women in a corporate setting or at a conference or something, I'll say to them, okay, I'm going to give you a list of a few items. I just want you to raise your hand when you hear one of them that you've experienced in the past week.
I'll raise my hand on my wife's behalf.
On your wife's behalf. I love it. So, and there's 9 items here. So it's just in the past week. And I rarely get through the list without everybody's hands up. So I'll read them, and you can tell me if your wife has experienced any of these in the last week. And anyone that's listening, also please take note. Brain fog, needing to get coffee in the morning to get you going, energy dips through the day, and I'll specify that by saying after lunch about, let's call it 1 o'clock to 4 o'clock in the afternoon.
I would say yes. I'll also mention that we have an 8-month-old baby, so she's in the midst of.
So she's in the middle
right now, and there's some bad nights.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Difficulty falling asleep. So mind is racing, or she's just wound up from the day. difficulty maintaining sleep, and specifically waking up somewhere in the middle of the night between 2 and 4 in the morning, inability to lose weight no matter what, needing to eat or snack frequently,
Mm-hmm.
moodiness, and salt cravings.
I hope she's not listening, but yeah.
It's like 8 of those 9 things. Yeah. And I share these things,
She just came over from the kitchen to point at
she's
me.
like, that sounds like me. Who was she describing me? What's going on?
She's like, now I'm going to break out the whip and you're going to be doing 70% of the housework.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I say this not to shame anybody. This is not like, look at all the things that you have wrong with you. This is just really just trying to demonstrate that we are in this constant running on adrenaline, contractive state. And when I say contractile or contractive state, what I'm talking about is your sympathetics. So your sympathetic, so we have the autonomic nervous system, which kind of sounds like automatic, and it sort of is. It happens, involuntarily. And there's 2 main branches of it. We have your sympathetics, often called, fight or flight and freeze, like those are the 3 Fs, or your stress response. And then we have your parasympathetics, which is the rest, digest, stay, and play, right? And when we are in this state of survival, which is your sympathetics, this is very contractile, right? Everything gets shut off. Your body is not, if there is a threat or a perceived threat to the organism, you are not going to be thinking about reproduction. You're not going to be thinking about digestion. You're not going to be thinking about your immune system. All your body is concerned with is surviving the impeding or the imposing threat. So your body is going to oppose insulin. So cortisol is a counter-regulatory hormone, meaning that it opposes insulin. Its job is to keep the glucose in the blood so that I can throw it to the periphery, right? So that it can throw it to the musculoskeletal system, because you either need to fight, flight, like get out of dodge, or the other option is just to freeze, right? Like the deer in headlights sort of look. So when you are constantly in this contractive state, you cannot repair, right? Your parasympathetics is where you repair, where you sleep, where you regenerate. So I often, and who this applies to is any woman. I'm sort of building this classic woman that I constantly see is like, she's between 30 and 55. She's either a new mom like your wife is, or she is a mom to, 2 to 3 kids, balancing a career. She, has had these sleepless nights. She's trying to kind of figure it all out. And her body is telling her that she's sort of, it's like when you look at your gas tank on your car and you see the gas is starting to get into that red zone, and then you get the little thing up on the dashboard, right? Like most women are like, I need to find a gas station, but I just not yet. I just need to get 2 or more things done on my to-do list before I go and find the Esso or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
And the issue around this is, if you do not get a handle on your chronic stress, and when I say stress, I use the word inflammation and stress interchangeably. Okay, so chronic low-grade stress or chronic low-grade inflammation over time, if you don't get a handle on it, it's going to supersede your body's ability to maintain balance, what we call homeostasis. And we talked about, what stress does, keeps you in this state of, threat or survival. I wanted to just define for a moment the different types of stress that may be applicable to you, because we have acute and chronic, but then there's also different verticals in terms of what would constitute as stress. So we would have physical stress, right? Everyone's sitting at their desk all day, or if they're a new mom, they're breastfeeding, they're sort of flexed over. We have chemical stress, so the foods that we eat, the environment we live in. For women, it's the makeup that we put on day in, day out that has like all the toxic stuff in it. And then our mental health as well, our early childhood experiences, what we were told in terms of our worth, what the cultural norms around, whatever culture you grew up in terms of what the view was on women, any maltreatment that you may have sustained as a child. Like we call this, big T and little t trauma. Big T would be physical abuse, sexual abuse, emotional abuse. little t trauma, things like bullying, being harassed, death of a pet, things that are that can still play in on our psychology. So we want to be thinking about how we can get a handle on acute stress, because if we can't get a handle on it, eventually we have to cut it out as cancer, or we have to take, medication for our cardiovascular disease, or we have a cerebral, a lifestyle disease like diabetes or stroke or any of these things, or mental health issues. So wanted to just carve out those two as predecessors to the way that it affects a woman's menstrual cycle. So I wanted to move into, if I can, talking a little bit about menstruation. Easily, one of the most beautiful blessings that we have is the ability to bring life into and onto the planet. But and if you think about it, every single month for about 35 or 40 years, we are growing a new organ, getting rid of it and starting again. Like it's the most beautiful thing, but it can also be really energetically taxing. And by the way, for the women that are listening that are in their 40s and perimenopausal, this is also for you. So I find a lot of women are like, oh, but I'm like in my, my period's starting to change the frequency. You also, I define perimenopause as after 35, because we start seeing a stepwise attenuation or a stepwise decline in progesterone from about 35 to, 49, 50, which is when menopause tends to happen for most women. So we want to be thinking about ways that we can understand our menstrual cycle. And we're going to get into some of the fixes. I know I'm like painting this picture of doom and gloom right now, but I promise that there's solutions. So we want to talk about what we want to pay attention to our menstrual cycle like it's a vital sign. So if you were to go into a hospital, they would take your temperature, they take your heart rate, they take your blood pressure, they would look at your oxygenation. And for women, I want us to start looking at our menstrual cycle as an additional vital sign for our health and vitality. It is a great marker of the hormonal integrity and the hormonal landscape that we have every month. So what is a normal period? And then we can get into how we can start eating and training and fasting in accordance with that.
Sounds good.
So whenever, and I'll just pause here for a moment and say, I've given this talk to, I was at an a female entrepreneurial group. And I was like, okay, we're just going to start by explaining to you what your period is. Like, we're going to talk about the things that happen in each of the 4 weeks. And these are some of the most intelligent women I've ever met in my life. And they were like, holy crap, I didn't realize that all this was happening. So I think that there's value in empowering you with the different cyclical changes that happen through the month. And then we'll play into how you can change your food, how you can change your training and all that. So we're assuming that your cycle is about 4 weeks. It's about 28 days. And the only reason why we're doing 28 days is because I can't do math, and it divides evenly by 7, which is a week. Okay. So a normal menstrual cycle can be longer than 28 days. It can be up to 35 days is considered normal. 26, 27, up to 35. So we're just going to generally speak in weeks. Of course, if your menstrual cycle is longer than 28 days, then you're just going to divide it into those 4 quadrants. Okay. So week 1 of your menstrual cycle is what we call the bleed week. So this is, what, we traditionally call your period, right? All your hormones here, this is when you are shedding the endometrial lining. Your estrogen levels are low, your progesterone levels are low, testosterone level, everything is low because you're just like you're shedding the organ, you're shedding the endometrial lining. This is, just as a side, this is a great time for you to play with fasting. And we'll get into the different types and the different lengths and the different frequencies of fasting in a moment. But the first 2 weeks in general of your cycle, you are much more resilient. It is a much more hormonally resilient time for you to be experimenting with fasting or fasting mimetics like a ketogenic diet. And we'll get into what constitutes an appropriate ketogenic diet for women. But just in the back of your mind, the first 2 weeks, great for fasting, great for keto. Week 2 is the week before you ovulate. So I actually think that we have the naming of the menstrual cycle all wrong, because the main point of your menstrual cycle is not to bleed. The main point is to ovulate. So I actually think that ovulation should be your week 1. Like when you ovulate is week 1, but there's no clear and distinct marker like blood is. So I just wanted to make that little note that the point of your menstrual cycle is not to have a period or not to bleed. The point is to ovulate. And between days 7 and 14, you're seeing estrogen's first rise in that 28-day cycle. So estrogen is a potent growth factor. She is trying to mature the follicle and the egg within it. And we are also seeing a rise in testosterone. So this is really important, and I'll come back to this when we talk about training, but this is, if we're talking about profiting from testosterone, like testosterone is involved in keeping our lean body mass high. It's involved in fat burning. This week is my favorite time in the whole cycle to do very heavy resistance training. So we'll come back to that, but I wanted to just mention testosterone comes up this week. This is when we feel really flirty, really sexy. This is when we want to have a lot of sex because Mother Nature is a smart, she's a wily minx. Like she knows that the egg is coming around day 14. So if she can get sperm in and around the egg, we know that sperm lasts for about 6 to 7 days on either end. So you're going to feel flirty, sexy, extroverted in that week. So it's just a good little reminder. So if you want a baby, this is the time where you should be ramping up your sex. And if you don't want a baby, then we want to be thinking about other ways that you can be having fun with your partner or yourself.
Then you have to suppress all of your biological urges and everything nature is telling you to do.
Right. I mean, and there's other things that you can do other than penetration, but yes, that would be the week, like just depending on what your goals are, baby or no baby, you want to modify your behavior appropriately. So then we have the main event. We have luteinizing hormone, which I always liken to that, awkward uncle that comes in, like smacks everybody on the back when they come in for Easter, and then you just kind of like spit your food out. At least, I mean, I have an uncle like that. So
That's quite a metaphor.
So just think about luteinizing hormone kind of comes in like a bang, and then out comes the egg from the follicle, or, in my case, whenever my uncle comes over for Easter, he hits me on the back, and I'm often.
Is your uncle named Lou by any chance? Like you're we can think of this as the crazy weird Uncle Lou in every woman's uterus.
It's not Lou, and I won't out him, but yeah. So he's the crazy uncle. So that's luteinizing hormone, and now we have the egg. Okay, so now she's out and she's waiting for fertilization. So in that third week, now we are moving into the second 2 weeks of your menstrual cycle. So it's called the secretory phase, or the luteal phase of your cycle, because now the follicle becomes, I always call it the artist formerly known as the follicle. It's now the corpus luteum. So the luteum is now going to be secreting progesterone and other things. So we'll get to progesterone in a minute. So week 3, your entire hormonal milieu changes. So now we go from being sexy and wanting lots of sex and being extroverted and flirty and all that. And now we tend to, in terms of personality and hormonally, we tend to become more inward. Metabolism changes during this time as well. So we're starting to see progesterone, and I have it on the slide here, which is the purple line. We're starting to see progesterones rise during these last 2 weeks. So she peaks at about day 21, so end of the third week, beginning of the fourth week. And we know that progesterone is a potent stimulator of your appetite, slows down your bowel movements, can affect your mood as well. So for any woman who thinks that she is crazy or there's something wrong with her because she has more cravings in her third or fourth week, it's not you. It's progesterone. She is the dominant hormone in this 2 weeks here. And in week 4, this is the week right leading up to your period. So at about day 21, we said progesterone peaks, and then over the course of the next 7 days, it's really the next 3 or 4 days, if there's no fertilization of the egg, progesterone drops. And then that's when we start to get, what ends up happening is we get ischema of the endometrial lining, and then the lining dies. And then that's when we start to shed it. And then, week 1 starts again. But in week 4, what I wanted to say is most chronic issues. So if you are a type 2 diabetic, or you have irritable bowel, or you suffer from PMS or PMDD, these are the times when this last week, all of that is going to be amplified. You are going to feel like you are more inflamed, and we'll get into some of the particulars in terms of hormonal potential hormonal derangements that can amplify that. But just know that in the last week in particular, you have increased metabolic demands. You are utilizing glucose, you are utilizing amino acids, you're utilizing free fatty acids at a much higher rate than you are at any time of the month. So it is an appropriate response to increase your caloric consumption during this time, because everything is going, whether you want to or not, all of your energy as a woman, your sex hormones are going towards creating or going to perpetrate the thickening of this endometrial lining in anticipation of pregnancy. I'm throwing a lot at you. How are you doing so far?
I'm doing wonderfully, but I've had a lot of courses covering this material, so I'm fairly familiar with it. But it's nice to hear you inject the aspects of caloric intake and how training. I mean, to start to see how the pieces of how you can modulate your food intake and your training in accordance with it, and in accordance with this menstrual cycle. And that's all new information that I get to layer onto this picture. And it's fascinating to hear you talk about that.
Amazing. Okay, I'm great. Can I keep going?
Yeah, absolutely. Please.
Magic carpet ride. Okay.
Yes.
So the two, so you can see that there are a lot of potentials here for hormonal imbalances, like the hormonal landscape, there can be disturbances in the force, right? Like there's a lot of potential areas where we can see derangement, imbalances, inappropriate responses, etc. As it relates to women, the two most common things I see are excess androgens and excess estrogens. So androgens are the testosterones. PCOS is the most common embodiment of that, or polycystic ovarian syndrome. This is often one of the classic hallmarks of a woman who has too much testosterone, is that her body behaves in a more male fashion. So she will have more weight through the belly. She may have excess hair through areas that she may not want. So she may have excess facial hair, hair on the chest, hair on the back, and then she may lose hair where she doesn't want. So hair, losing a hair sort of in a line with male pattern hair loss. So at the temples, around the crown, that kind of thing. We also typically see with her hyperinsulinemia. So remember I was talking before about that, glucose insulin dance being off in type 2 diabetics. A woman with PCOS also displays that. And we know that insulin and testosterone are very intimately related. So when you have too much insulin, you also have too much testosterone. So in terms of, and maybe I'll ask you before I go on, I can talk about PCOS and sort of how we modify that through her menstrual cycle. And then the other one I wanted to talk about was estrogen dominance, or that's the common term for it, but it's unopposed estrogen in the luteal phase of her cycle, but people call it estrogen dominance. So we can talk about those.
I would go with estrogen dominance, just because I think it's probably way, way, way more common. I'm curious if you'd agree with me on that, but that's my understanding.
Yeah, I would say that they're like tied for first place.
Oh, okay.
For me. Yeah. So PCOS is probably the most common hormonal derangement that I see, and I would say estrogen. Like those are 1 and 2, like estrogen dominance, and
well, then
PCOS.
We'll do it as a coin flip, and I will leave it up to you to decide where we go.
I love it. Okay. So for a woman, and maybe what we'll do is I'll talk about a woman. For the challenge with a woman with PCOS is because her luteinizing hormones, that funny uncle that comes in, that doesn't necessarily happen. We don't see that surge. Like, he doesn't blow into the door and hit you on the back and then leave the way that he should. He's kind of always there. So you don't actually get that surge of LH. So what we find is that women can, you don't have the correct follicular development. And then we don't have that release, that appropriate release there. So for a woman who is dealing with PCOS, one of the interventions, or I'll say two of the most powerful interventions, well, maybe three of the most powerful interventions, is we integrate fasting. So there's different types of fasting, frequency and duration of fasting. So a woman with PCOS, I really like to give her what I call a non-caloric liquid fast, which is basically water and herbal tea. And you have to increase her, like anyone, when you start fasting, you have to slowly increase tolerance to it because it is a stressor. So I like to use a non-caloric liquid fast with a woman with PCOS. I love a low carbohydrate or a ketogenic application for her because we want to lower the insulin burden. So we're getting those insulin levels lower so that the cells become more sensitized to them. And then the other thing we want to do is resistance training. So, and really, when we're talking about when we're talking about some of these different hormonal pieces, resistance training is always going to be part of my recommendation. And the reason for that is the more lean muscle mass that you have. We were talking before about substrates, and we were talking about where we store our substrates. So the two biggest glucose depots, if you will, the glycogen storage sites, are your liver, and then your muscles. And the more functional tissue that you have, the more active, alive tissue that you have, the more carbohydrates you can actually eat, but you will be a much more efficient disposer of glucose because your muscles are going to require that for upkeep. So it is really useful for a woman who is already hyperinsulinemic to be training and using like heavy weights, like not like, and you won't, and I promise for any woman, you will not turn into the Hulk. I mean, this is still a persistent thing I have to talk to women about.
Yeah, I was a personal trainer for many years in my 20s. So very familiar with that belief. And I used to tell my female clients, I used to say, I wish it were true that growing muscles were this easy. And because I would be huge by now. I would have 50 pounds more muscle than I have because I've been weight training since I was 14 years old. I'm 36 now. And I really wish it was that easy to get muscle.
I mean, we see men who want to put on muscle struggle with it. And, when we think about the difference in testosterone levels between men and women, it's something like a 10x difference in terms of the amount of testosterone that we have, even in someone who is androgen dominant, even someone who is not aromatizing her testosterones into her estrogens the way that somebody with PCOS is doing. So resistance training is going to also help with, like I was saying, the glucose disposal, helping with her hyperinsulinemia. And in terms of how we would nuance that throughout the month, the first 2 weeks, I would say first week is sort of medium weights. And when I say medium weights, this is, 8 to 10 reps. So you're kind of struggling on rep 8, rep 9. That would be like a medium weight and maybe 3 sets. In that week before ovulation. So for a woman who has PCOS, often she doesn't know when she's ovulating. So sometimes we just pick a line in the sand and just start. But if you have a general sense of when you think your period should be coming, we can sort of triangulate generally within, 2 or 3 days when we think your ovulation should happen. So 7 days leading up to that, heavy AF weights, right? We want to be like 4 to 5 repetitions. And that's like to get 4 reps, like I mean, heavy weights. As that changes in the luteal phase, we want to go back to medium weights into that 3rd week. And then in the week leading up to her period, it's really, I'm really a big fan of being not so much a movement specialist, but more of a movement generalist, right? Like we have all these like CrossFitters and soul cyclists and people who can just, do this one particular activity really, really well. But what we've lost as a society, and I think this is true for women and men, is this idea of just low grade general movement through the day, like walking, yoga, things that are not necessarily particularly strenuous, but they are moving our bodies where we are getting, blood moving, and it's gentle exercise. So that week 4 is where I like to give, uh, because progesterone is sort of dropping at that point. Testosterone is typically low there. This is a recovery week for most women that I work with. And I'll say that for the type A women that are listening to me that don't want to take a recovery week, who do Soul Cycle 5, and nothing against Soul Cycle, by the way. Like, I think it's a great class, lots of fun, great music. But if you're doing that 4 or 5 times a week and you continue to put your head down and punch out these high intensity interval training exercises every single day, no matter where you are in your menstrual cycle, your body will hold on to fat like it is an insurance policy, because you need to give yourself time to recover. That's where all your gains come, is in the recovery. That's a pet peeve of mine, as you can probably tell, because I myself am a recovering type A person. And I used to do that too. It's like, it doesn't matter. I'll pretend I'm a guy. I'll just like punch it out, get through it. But that's where we make the mistake. That's where injury happens. And if you're injured and you can't work out and your ego if you need to silence your ego by getting to the gym and you can't because you're injured, this is really when you can sort of start to lose your marbles.
Yeah, it's not just true of women. It's also true of men. Obviously, we don't have the menstrual cycle factor, but it is certainly true. I mean, I can speak for myself that there were many years where I was in a chronic state of overtraining and trying to do 2 hours of intense exercise every day, 7 days a week, not giving my body enough time to recover. And it was only when I eased up a bit that I started making progress, and that I just felt more vitality and energy, because I was in a constant state of feeling drained as a result of overtraining.
Well, what you're doing is you're just driving sympathetic dominance. You're just driving, you're reinforcing exercise is a hormetic stress. I mean, it is a stressor, but over the long term, there are lots of benefits from it. We have sirtuin activation. We have longevity things that come from it. There's metabolic and cardiovascular. There's all these different great things that come from exercise. But if you are not varying the type of exercise that you are doing, and you are simply just driving yourself into, it's just like an adrenaline. You're constantly driving yourself into this like survival state. Essentially, your body is going to say, okay, like, we have this high intensity output every single day, 5 to 7 days a week. Like I have to hold on to fat. Like I need energy. So
you mentioned variety there, movement variety, exercise variety. How big of a factor do you think the variety aspect is relative to just the proper balance between exercise and recovery?
I think it's important to vary your exercises. Otherwise, like I was saying, we become more movement specialists. Like if you only go to the gym and you do bicep curls, like you're going to get really damn good at doing a bicep curl. But what's your posterior delt look like? What's the integration of your shoulder, your shoulder stability? What's your erector spinae can you activate your multifidi independently? No. So for sure, I think that we need to have variations, and even within the weight training protocol, you need to have variations in there. I have talked a lot about the coronal plane versus the sagittal plane in terms of training. Like we live in the midline, right? Like we're here all the time. We're at our computers, we're on our phones, we go to the gym, we do the elliptical, which is just back and forth. For those of you that can't hear me right now or see me, I'm kind of doing like the elliptical hand thing. You do the bike, you're doing this with, you're in the midline. We never do anything that's out here. We never do anything that works the midline or moves away from the midline, AB and adduction. So yeah, I'm a big fan of that, because there's a lot of different, there's a lot of evidence to support that it also supports the lateral aspects of your brain, right? We look at SPECT scans and we look at degeneration of the brain over time. And if you're constantly in the midline, just working sagittal and maybe the transverse plane, and you don't work out here, then you lose it. And
So just
Yeah.
for people who maybe don't have the technical background to follow the planes of movement that you're talking
Sure.
about, or who are not
Sorry.
watching the
Yes.
video and can't see which
Yes.
direction you're pointing, can you give some specific examples of like what you would consider too much of the sagittal plane type of movement in the absence of, the side to side frontal plane movements, and what
Yeah. So
specific exercises or examples?
sure. Thank you. So sagittal plane is basically any cardio machine that you see at your gym. It would be things that are moving forward and back. So this is like flexion and extension. So bicep curls would be, well, maybe bicep curls would also do transverse plane, but anything that's like flexion and extension. So we think about the elliptical machine, your legs are going forward and back. We think about the bike, your legs are, even though they're going in a circle, they're going forward and back. It's quads and hamstrings, quads and hamstrings. And I love the bike, right? I have I fitted my outdoor bike inside now. I do my bike, 2 times a week, 3 times a week. But it's important to, and the reason why I bring that up is we spend most of our life in the midline. Like if you are sitting at a computer desk all day long, your keyboard is likely in front of you, your screen is likely in front of you, and over the course of the day, what we know is that your head comes further and further, your thoracic cavity flexes, and you become more and more rounded, and these are all in the sagittal plane. So the coronal plane is moving away from the midline. So if we think about exercises like warrior 2 in yoga, so you have your legs that are spread apart, your arms are extended out. These are, that would be a coronal plane exercise. A curtsy squat would be a coronal plane exercise where you're taking one leg, stepping behind and out to the side as the stationary leg and squatting. Anything that uses like jumping side to side, like if you were to do what are those things called? Skaters? What are they called?
Speed skater.
Thank you. Speed skaters, where you are jumping from side to side. Things like that are coronal plane exercises. Lateral raises with your shoulders, even rotatory motions, right? So when we use some of the smaller stability muscles in the spine, so the rotatories, the multifidus being a really big proprioceptive input to the brain, when we look at the orientation of those muscles, they come out to the side. So we need to, we can talk about longevity and, spinal stability and maintaining the curves in the spine and all that, but the multifidus muscle, when we look at it, it originates off of the spine and it sort of goes out in like it almost makes like a triangle and attaches to the top of the hip. So rotational type of movement. So if you're sitting on your bum and you have like a medicine ball and you're rotating side to side, you're going to be activating some of those coronal muscles, particularly in the back. So these are really important to be thinking about when you're thinking about functional training, because we already do a lot of this midline movement. We're already in the sagittal plane more than we should be. And, we can talk about ancestral, like the way our ancestors moved and stuff. But right now, no one's getting away from the computer. So we have to figure out a way to adapt to that. So the way that I think about this problem is integrating more coronal plane stuff. So the squatting and the warrior pose and all the things that we've described.
Excellent. So do you want to get into more details of kind of the framework of practical recommendations around
Yes.
the specific like nutrition way to modulate your nutrition and your training around the menstrual cycle?
Yeah, I would love to. Thank you. I feel like I could talk to you all day. Like I
Yeah,
go on like all these different verticals on terms of health. But.
This is fascinating. And I have to say on a personal note that, I've done 250 plus interviews with a lot of experts in all kinds of topics. And I can really tell when somebody has a superficial knowledge of their subject matter and when somebody has a really deep knowledge of the subject matter. And there are certain people that I interact with where I can tell I can ask them anything on any topic in their domain of expertise, and they're going to know, all the research on that topic and be able to just spout it off the top of their head. And I can already tell you're in that category for sure.
Thank you. I really appreciate that. Thank you.
Yeah.
So the one thing I wanted to say for the women that are listening is I just want to if any of this is, if we've been talking about PCOS, we've been talking about estrogen dominance, we've been talking about some of these hormonal things like the leptin and the sympathetic dominance, you're on your, you feel like you're running on empty. I just also want to say that I do have the philosophical perspective and underpinning that you have an inborn and innate capacity to heal. Your body is not your enemy. The symptoms that you're experiencing is just your body's way of asking you to get out of your head, to sink beneath your throat, and it's an invitation for you to deepen the relationship that you have with yourself. I mean, at the end of the day, you have kids, you have partners. The most important relationship that you will ever have is with yourself, and getting to know your cadence, getting to know your cyclical biology is one of the most empowering things you can do as a woman. So I just wanted to say that, because so many times I say this as an empowering statement, because I want us to shed the victim story that we may have adopted, whether that's cultural norms or, our upbringing or what have you, and into a place of power where we can actually say, okay, so this is where I am, and these are the steps that I need to take. And the steps that I've outlined, we've talked a lot about them already, but just some foundational basics. We're going to talk about just some circadian biology stuff, nutrition, stress management. We've talked a lot about movement. And I always like to, just invite the women that are listening to just put on your big girl pants, right? Like, you are already a goddess. You are already exactly who you need to be. It's just about like peeling off some of the layers. I just wanted to just plant that, because I think that so much of our healing, I can give you all the information. I can geek out with you on nutritional science. We could talk about movement. But if you don't believe that you're worth it, you are going to find a way to, medicate or do things that, and not to poo-poo medication. Of course, sometimes it's necessary, but
I don't mind. Not offending me.
Yeah, you can't medicate your way out of a problem that you behaved your way into. So you have the capacity. It's just a matter of like unleashing, I don't know if did you watch the movie Captain Marvel?
Captain Marvel? I don't think so. No.
Oh, she's one of my favorite superhero films. And so she has this like chip on her neck the whole time, and she's like controlled by this higher power. And at the pinnacle, the climax of the movie, she says, I have had this chip, I'm paraphrasing it, but I've had this chip on my neck the whole time. It's like I've been fighting with one hand behind my back. Like, what happens when I finally set myself free? Like, everybody has that capacity to set themselves free. So I just wanted to start with that. Mm-hmm. The easiest way to help with your energy levels is circadian biology. And by that, I mean sleep. So I always joke that this is the cheapest diet on the planet. Like, before you shell out the bucks to any nutrition program, before you work with me or any other person, commit, pinky promise that you will sleep 8 hours every night for the next 7 days. And you will see your belly weight. Your belly is going to go down. Your weight is going to drop. Your mood is going to be better. You're going to, the brain fog that you may have experienced is going to be gone. You're going to be motivated to do right by exercise and by nutrition. So
lest we forget energy.
And energy, of course. Yeah. Your energy is going to be higher.
Yeah.
And we know that when you have poor sleeping, of course, if you've had a bad night, I mean, your wife may be able to really relate to this now. But when you don't sleep well, we know that you have inferior fuel partitioning. And what I mean by that is your body you are going to have a tendency to eat more crap. Like, you're going to want to eat more of the simple processed sugary, simple sugars that can be readily switched into glucose. And then we also use that fuel in an inferior way. And of course, when you're sleep deprived, like, who wants to go to the gym? 0% of people want to do that. And you're just not and your regulation, your emotional regulation is also poor. So when we were talking before about the prefrontal cortex, your prefrontal cortex is very much sensitive to, blue light technology, but sleep deprivation is the thing that your PFC is very, very sensitive to. And she, the CEO, as I like to call it for my ladies, or, the CEO, right? She is the prefrontal cortex right behind the forehead. That is the area that is regulating those lower emotional centers in your limbic centers. So 8 hours, and by 8 hours, that means that you're not in bed for 8 hours. That means you're probably in bed closer to 9, because you have the latency, like you have to fall asleep and, the waking up, and then, maybe a little bit of buffer time there. Couple of really best practices for sleep. Room is cold, so 65 to 68 degrees Fahrenheit. For the rest of the world, that's 15 to 18 degrees centigrade. Room is dark. No devices. An hour to 2 before you're going to go to bed. No meals, same time frame. Like, you want to allow the stomach to empty. So that would be what we would call time restricted eating or intermittent fasting. Sometimes people refer to it as that. If you're traveling, this is my best travel tip. So a lot of people are like, well, doc, I travel a lot. Bring warm, fuzzy socks to your hotel room. And you're going to make the hotel room as cold as you can. And you're going to wear socks. And you do this at home as well. But this is particularly good if you are traveling, because the way that we fall asleep is we have to lower our core body temperature. So if you have warm, fuzzy socks on, you are literally going to charm the heat away from your core down to your extremities, where it can be evaporated. So that's if you're traveling and you're having trouble sleeping, warm, fuzzy socks, that's my best travel tip for you. And of course, sex and orgasms, right? Like, that's a different conversation, but, orgasms are nature's lunesta. It is the best way to hack into your parasympathetics. It is the best way to have that expansive, we've been talking about the sympathetics being this like contractile, sort of energetic, like just in survival mode. The ability to let go, literally let go and have an orgasm, is very expansive. It's very parasympathetic. And of course, it's the comedic, like you finish, you roll over and you fall asleep. Like, that's the best way that you can, best practices for sleep. So that's what I would start with. We've talked a little bit about movement in terms of the coronal plane.
Quick question on circadian rhythm.
Yes,
I will say circadian rhythm is a big area of specialization for me, and something I emphasize a lot. And I agree 100% with you that I've actually polled my audience, and consistently circadian rhythm optimization and the stuff I teach around that, people rate as the single biggest needle mover in what fix their energy issues. Mm-hmm. So I agree with you 100%. Just out of curiosity, is there any relationship of the menstrual cycle with circadian rhythm? Like, is there a particular time of the month that maybe women should prioritize it even more, and prioritize maybe an extra half an hour or hour of sleep each night?
Thank you for asking me that. And I forgot to mention that. Yes. So when we think in general, a woman's sleep cycle tends to be longer than a man's. So this is, maybe this is a different topic around sleep divorces and, sleeping separately and stuff. But a lot of times we know about, on average, a woman's sleep cycle is about 15 to 20 minutes longer than a man's sleep cycle is. So what that means, our total sleep cycle, not just the 90-minute, like going through REM and phase 1, 2, and 3 sleep. So what we know about sleep disturbances in terms of a woman's cycle is she is going to tend to, because we see progesterone peak at the end of week 3 and the beginning of week 4, we tend to see her core body temperature beginning to rise. So progesterone, I didn't mention this before, but just as a little hack to remember it, progestation, pro-pregnancy. It's your pro-pregnancy hormone. So this is going to start increasing your core body temperature. And as I just mentioned with the little travel tip with the socks, the way that we fall asleep is when we lower our core body temperature. So if your core body temperature is now up to 1%, which is a huge, like, if for any of the women who wear like their Aura rings and their I always get dinged. I want to like write Aura, can you please account for our menstrual cycles? Because the week before my period, I always get dinged on my readiness because my core body temperature is up like 0.9 degrees Fahrenheit. Mm-hmm. So your core body temperature raises, it's much higher in week 4. So you will notice that there is going to be a harder time, not necessarily initiating sleep if you're doing things like you're being conscientious of the blue blocking and the device use and the feeding times, but you will notice potentially that you might wake up during a sleep cycle. So this is the issue of maintaining sleep rather than initiating. So it's not necessarily a melatonin issue. It's more of an issue of maintaining that sleep cycle because you're being pulled out of it because of your temperature. And that's actually how we wake up, right? We wake up because our core body temperature over the course of the night begins to slowly rise. So for women who are having trouble sleeping, the tips and tricks that I talked about in terms of like the cold room, the dark room, there's a company, I have no affiliation with them, but it's called the Chili Pad, where you can it's like something that just goes right underneath your sheets, and it makes your bed colder, and you can, modulate up or down the temperature. I have found that to be a lifesaver for the women that I've worked with who particularly deal with PMS type syndromes, and they get that sleep deprivation. So pay particular attention to your sleep hygiene in the end of week 3 and into week 4, leading up to your period.
Awesome. What about nutrition and training? Perfect.
So what I wanted to talk about in terms of nutrition is, and this is for if you've identified, maybe I have a leptin sensitivity issue, I have chronic stress, I have androgen issues, I have estrogen issues. There are a couple things that I love. The first is green leafy vegetables across the board. So things like kale and broccoli and Swiss chard and cauliflower is not green, but it's part of the brassica family. These have all been shown to lower inflammation. They're fibrous as well. So when we think about insoluble fiber, it cannot be broken down in the small intestine for use as a fuel. So it makes its way through the gut, sort of cleans up. The roughage will sort of clean up the gut. It attracts water to it, bulks up the stool. So you're helping with your bowel movements, which is really important in week 3 and week 4 as well, because we have that peak of progesterone. And I said before, progesterone is an appetite stimulant. It also slows down your bowels. So making sure that you're eating fibrous vegetables all through the month, but in particular in week 3 and 4 is going to be really, really helpful for you. And there's also, the brassica family, like I always joke, it's like the Kardashians of the food family, because there's so many great ones. You don't know which one is your favorite, right? So they're all beautiful. They're all great.
That's how I feel about the Kardashians. There's so many great ones. It's hard to decide.
Like that one's sulforaphane and that one's, yeah. So when we think about cruciferous vegetables, like the brassica family, this is like the royal family, right? We know that it decreases pro-inflammatory pathways like the NF-kappa B pathway, all these different pathways that are involved in just in general inflammation in the body, general stress. It also, one of the big things that we think about as women, or we should be thinking about as women, is cardiovascular disease. It's the number one killer, men and women. Reduces all-cause mortality. Like there's a direct link, like the more of the brassica family, the more of the cauliflowers and the Brussels sprouts and the more that you consume of those, the less like you will live longer, and it will improve your lipid profiles. It decreases your breast cancer risk. And if I can't, convince you on that, like you have better skin, hair, and nails. Like you just, if living longer and, not having breast cancer, if I can't, and sometimes I have to say that and the other thing I'll say is, with the hair thing, it stimulates hair. So this only been done in rodent studies, but it reduced balding giving mice sulforaphanes reduced balding. And we also know that the brassica family is the more cruciferous vegetables that you eat, the more fat burning, like lipolysis, like the breaking down of fat as a constituent for energy we have. So no matter where you're coming from, chronic low-grade stress, androgen stuff, estrogen stuff, leptin stuff, integrating more of the green leafy vegetables into your diet. And whenever I'm teaching about this, the way that when you're building a plate, what you want to be thinking about is answering, and this is what I do with my kids. So this is how I've taught my kids to build a plate. Where's the plants? That's the first question. Where's the fats? And then where's the protein? So the plants should make up the bulk of your plate. So if you're having, maybe it's like a bed of kale or sauteed Swiss chard or Brussels sprouts. And then you have, the protein. We can talk about protein cycling through your menstrual cycle as well, because I think that we should be protein cycling through there as well for driving driving muscle protein synthesis too. But protein in general, I like it to be for women about the size of your palm. Mark Hyman talks about it as a the word condiment. It's like, it should be like a condiment, like the size of your, which I think is so clever. So I take that from him. So if you ever a child and you had, French fries and you were like, oh, I have to put ketchup next to it. The amount of ketchup that you would sort of squeeze is about the amount of protein. If you're doing a ketogenic diet, that you would be like, it's a moderate amount of protein, maybe 20 to 30% of your protein intake. And I would cycle that, just while we're talking about proteins. I'm a big proponent of animal products as your protein source, but I am open and loving to those who choose to be vegetarian or vegan. You just need more. You will just be mindful that whenever you are choosing vegetarian protein options, that in order to get the amount of leucine, in order to get the amount of muscle protein synthesis from vegetarian sources, you're going to need more calories. So just kind of be mindful of that. But I like to cycle protein through a woman's menstrual cycle. So week 1, like the bleed, I definitely like it to be like a classic keto diet. Like that's a time when you can play with fasting. That's a time when you can play with keto. In week 2, where we're seeing testosterone peaking right before ovulation, that time when you're feeling kind of flirty and sexy. This is also a time, like I said, do heavy weights, but also up your protein consumption, because the thing that we know about protein is that it drives something called MPS, muscle protein synthesis, which just does what it sounds like. It makes protein, makes muscle protein. So you need about 2 to 2.5 grams of leucine. So when we're thinking about like an animal, like a whey protein, it might be 20 to 25 grams of protein to start that initiate. Like that's sort of like the leucine is like the forewoman. She's the kind of girl that comes in and gets the gears started in order to start making protein. So you need a minimum of about 20 to 25 grams of protein to start that. During that week, right before your ovulation, when your testosterone is, I love for you to be having somewhere between 40 and around 40 to 50 grams per meal. There's also the whole conversation around like anabolic resistance as we age and stuff, but like, we'll keep it with like keto, like, 20 to 25 grams or 20% of your macronutrients in week 1. I like to up it to about 40% in week 2. And then in week 3, I cycle the keto. So keto on and off. So one day doing a classic keto ratio, which would be about 70% fat, 20% protein. And then the fill would be carbohydrates, like 10% carbohydrates. And then the other days we start to increase, we will do a carb up day with more fibrous vegetables, root vegetables, turnips, even things like squash when it's in season.
I like that you're not hardcore, just full blown keto nonstop.
No, we're not meant to be.
I've seen some people with that position, and I've seen a lot of people, especially women, who seem to have been harmed from doing that long term. It
destroys your neurotransmitters. It messes up your metabolism, your period. I've had women come to me who've been amenorrheic, but they're in ketosis. So I say that I love the keto diet. I have a program. I have a program that runs it's ketogenic principles that are baked into the DNA of that program. But it is important for women to understand, and I think this is true for men, but particularly because we have a reproductive cycle. We are not meant to be in ketosis all the time.
Yeah.
And long term. So again, like harnessing that cadence and that cyclical ebb and flow of our metabolic requirements through the month is really important.
Yeah. Interestingly, I had a woman who specializes in chronic fatigue, who's an advocate of nonstop keto all the time, and kind of comes from the narrative, which is not true, that our ancestors all ate keto diets and, these kinds of things. She thinks it's the one true diet. And I actually challenged her on a few points, brought in a lot of data to the contrary, for example, on actual evidence on the diets of hunter-gatherers in the world today.
Mm-hmm.
And anyway, I got some negative blowback from people who are just of this just committed to this dogma that you have to be keto
Yeah.
all the time, and anybody who doesn't understand that they just don't get it, right? And so there's so many people out there who are dietary ideologues, who are slaves to their own belief system and their dogmas that they've created.
It's religious, isn't it? It's become cult-ish.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And I just to sort of back up what you were saying, if you are a woman who we've spent some time describing, like chronic low-grade inflammation, the leptin, the hormonal derangement. When we think about this in terms of energy, and of course I know I'm speaking to the choir here, but if you are in a chronic low-grade inflammation, that is going to induce a metabolic switch. So you're going to go from like ATP rich oxidative phosphorylation to a much less energetically efficient. You're going to move into aerobic glycolysis, and you're going to be increasing your reactive oxygen or you're going to be increasing your oxidative damage in the cell. You're going to have reduced glucose availability because your insulin is going to be off. Like there's this whole, you can't be in keto all the time. Like you can't, I mean, it's important. And, for a woman in the first 2 weeks of her cycle, she's much more resilient. She's much more adept to do like longer term fasts or to do the ketogenic diet. But not all the time.
Awesome.
Yeah,
I'm with you.
Yeah.
So just one more thing. You mentioned fasting very early on in this. And you mentioned, I think, the first week of the menstrual cycle is the best time to experiment with fasting. Do you want to briefly talk about that?
Sure. So there's different, this is a big part of what I teach. So when we think about fasting, there's different ways that we can apply it. So there's type of fast, there's length of fast, and there's frequency of fasting. So there's a lot of different types of fasting. I'll sort of categorize them as non-caloric liquid fasting. So we talked about this as it relates to PCOS. So things like water and herbal teas, like that's the most aggressive type of fast. There are non-caloric liquid fast. So things like bone broth, or a lot of people will drink
vegetable.
Where you're keeping the calorie content is still, it's a model of caloric restriction, truly. Like you're having, maybe 500, 600 calories, a bulletproof coffee, like the butter coffees, that might be a caloric liquid fast. And then there's like the caloric restriction and the fasting mimetics. So, what's Walter Longo's? I forget the
fasting
company,
mimicking diet.
but the fasting mimicking diet, and what's this product? Is it Prolon is the name?
Prolon, yeah.
Yeah. So he has a product where I believe it's it's prepackaged foods. I mean, you can do this at home, truly, but a day, like the first day is like, call it 800, 900 calories. And then there's like a stepwise attenuation as the 5 days goes on. So maybe day one, you have like 800 calories, and the second day, 600, 500, 400, et cetera. And you could truly do that with just like avocados at home. But, if you want to try his product, that's fine too. So there's fasting mimetics where you're still eating, but you are maybe restricting a macronutrient. So a ketogenic diet is technically also a fasting mimetic because you're restricting the macronutrient carbohydrate. You're restricting carbs. So the way that I like to play with fasting through a woman's cycle, the first week, like I've said a few times, my favorite time to play with fasting if you've never done fasting before, because you're most resilient during that time. If you are a seasoned faster or someone who fasts regularly, you can try to go for a longer period of time. Playing with, if there's like a couple of levers when we think about fasting, like playing with the duration lever. In the second week, I still think it's a great time to fast, but because the testosterone is there, I want to limit the fasting to more of a time restricted eating model. So you're still This is what people call intermittent fasting. It's really, you're eating every day. You're just restricting the hours in which you eat. In week 3, again, now we have this different hormonal landscape. So I like to have more, if you are going to play around with fasting, for this to be a bone broth fast with a caloric liquid fasting. And I only like it to be 24 hours. So again, when we think about, we're pulling sort of 2 levers. It's the type of fast and the duration of the fast. And for women who suffer from estrogen dominance, this is my favorite type of fast to prescribe for a woman, because she's often feeling bloated. It's like her rings typically don't fit during like that week 3 and week 4. So a caloric liquid fast is still a really nice way for her to be getting calories. And we're giving her, if it's bone broth, she's still getting a certain type of protein, which I'm a big advocate of. But she's also giving her body a chance to, she's giving her gut a chance to rest. And often with women with estrogen dominance, we also see that there's a lot of sluggishness in her detoxification pathways, particularly her, when we're thinking about conjugation. So bringing the intermediate and actually getting rid of it. So this is why I also love, by the way, green leafy vegetables. I know I'm jumping a little bit, but green leafy vegetables, I love this. Love, love, love this for my women with estrogen dominance, because when we think about detoxification, I'm not talking about like a silly juice cleanse. I'm talking about actual detoxification that the liver has a couple of main roles. One of them is like creating glucose. The other is like getting rid of endogenous toxins. So sulforaphanes, which is in those green leafy vegetables, that is a compound that has been shown to upregulate phase 2 detoxification in the liver. So really big fan of bone broth for a woman with estrogen dominance, as well as lots of green leafy vegetables.
Mm-hmm. Do you want to wrap up? Do you want to go to just train you went to training earlier, and I think you pretty much covered it. Mm-hmm. But do you want to just kind of wrap up with like the quick summary of how to optimize training in accordance with the menstrual cycle?
Yes. So I would say the week 1 would be, if you're I want you to be doing resistance training. And this would be a minimum of 3 times a week, medium weights. So when we think about medium weights, it's like 8 to 10 reps. And that's like a good amount. Like you're exerting a lot of effort there, 3 sets. Week 2 is like, it's like do or die. That's like when we got testosterone, we got to profit from her. So, or profit from him, if we're thinking about the phenotypic expression. So we want to have high weight, low reps. So as much weight as you can punch out 4 reps. That's really what we want. And I like to do 4 sets because I'm crazy. But if you are just starting out, we can do 3 sets. Into week 3, you can start bringing it back down to that moderate weight. And I would also start playing around with low. So the moderate weight is like 8 to 10 reps, 3 sets. I also like, in terms of the resistance training realm, I also like to start increasing the reps and doing lighter weights. So instead of now doing 8 to 10 reps, maybe now you're punching out 15 to 20 and you're doing, it can be 2 to 3 sets of that. And then in week 4 is really when I want lighter things. So that can be Pilates. It can be, and I shouldn't say yoga is a light thing, but it is, it's not it's a calisthenic, but it's not resistance training in the classical sense. So this is more of a recovery week that I like to prescribe for women, where we are allowing all the gains, gains with a Z, like all the gains that we've had in the first, 3 weeks of training, we're allowing for that integration, and there's a recovery week there so that you can go hard again next week.
Beautiful. So protein cycling, fasting, some tips on veggies, circadian rhythm tips, training tips, all on how to work with the female menstrual cycle. Dr. Estima, this has been awesome. Thank you so much for sharing your wisdom with all of the listeners. I really appreciate you coming on, and really, as you said earlier, I feel like I could talk to you for probably 3 more hours on all the details.
Yeah, man. We have to do it a separate time, but thank you for having me. It's been so fun. I love the opportunity to go on these little geeky magic carpet rides. So thank you for indulging.
Yeah. Thank you for coming on this one with me. For everybody listening who is interested in working with you or doing your programs, following your work, or working with you directly, where's the best place to do that?
It would be my website. So www.drstephaniestima.com. The program is called the Estima Diet.
Beautiful. Thank you so much. Really appreciate it. And look forward to the next conversation.
Thank you.